Welcome to this module in the HTML Fundamentals course. In this module, we're going to focus on tables in our HTML documents. We'll talk about table structure, the various components that make up a table. We're going to look at working with data in the table, how you represent it, different ways that you can modify your columns and your rows to span across, and also table formatting. And by this I mean formatting your table, not using tables for formatting. We'll get into a little bit more of that as we go, and I'll caution you against that over and over again. But here we're focused on using tables within our documents to represent data. You think about representing maybe programmers and their favorite languages, or how many programmers use a particular programming language, or research data that you want to represent in terms of temperatures and time. Those sorts of pieces of information are well suited for representation within tables. Tables are actually made up of several different components, and we'll see here as we go a table being created. So we have a table, and on that we might have a caption that provides the title or the key concept that the table conveys. So we see the table element. Inside of that we have the caption. You can see it rendered here above the table itself. We also have the notion of a header. So we add the T-head element, and you can see here highlighted that that includes the headers for the various columns that you're representing in your table. We also have the body, and the body is where we're going to represent the data itself. This is the various cells, the rows and columns where our data is going to be visible. And finally we have the footer, represented with a T-foot, and that's usually a single row. This is where we can call out totals, averages, those sorts of bits of information that we want to appear at the bottom of the table. And one thing you'll note in the markup is that the head and the foot actually come before the body. The head's not so surprising, but the foot actually comes before the body for a reason. In the specification, it's laid out that if you have lots and lots of rows, it's possible for clients, browsers in our case, to take that table and render it at a particular size, showing the header and footer and allowing you to do things like scroll through or page through the data. So it's important that the footer comes before the body so that the client knows how to render the head and foot without having to process all of the elements that are in the body. What I have here is my page that talks about the HTML lists module, and I want to add a table that's going to lay out the various types of lists, the uses, the tags that go along with that. So I'll add a table, and to that I'll add my caption. That's going to be my header or my title really for my table here. And then I can add a header and a footer. And don't really need the footer, but I want to show you what we can do with it. So I'll add one in here. And then we'll add in the body. So table body comes in last. And as I mentioned, the table footer does need to come before the table body, because it's possible for client browsers then to have all this information about how to start to render the table before they start processing the body. So if you have a really long body full of lots of data elements, it can start to render that out and show it to the user before it's processed all of those inner elements there. Now we can save that, come down and look at it, and it's pretty boring. We have a caption and nothing else showing up under there. And the reason is we haven't put anything in the header, the footer, or the body yet. We need some rows inside of our table and some columns full of data. Before we do that, I want to show you one other attribute of the table, and that is the summary. So we might put something in here that says this table lists the various elements related to creating lists. Something along those lines. This is a summary of our table and what it shows. And while this won't show up necessarily in the user interface in the browser, it is a summary of what this table shows and can be used for things like assisted readers for someone who's visually impaired. So it's a really helpful thing to have out there to provide a summary of that table information. Again, as we update, we don't really see any indication of that, but it could be shown or read to someone so they can get a better sense of what's in that particular table. So we need to go back now to the slides and we'll figure out how to fill in the rest of these portions of our table. We've seen how to create the basic structure of our table, but now we need to start adding some rows and column to get some data in there that we can see. We use the table row, or the TR element, to represent a row in the table. And we'll use this inside the header to represent a row of headings, in the footer to represent the various elements we might show in the footer, and in the body to represent the various rows of data. Now in the header, we use the table header data element, or a TH, to define the individual cells within that row, or the individual columns, you can think of them, in that row, and that will be where we'll actually put the data that we want to show up in the header. In the body and the footer, we use the table data, or the TD element, and that's how we define the cell data for the body or the footer. So the TD and the TH are essentially the same thing, but we use the TH in the header to represent those header items. Let's go into our document here now. We've got our T head, and we'll just add a row to that, a table row, and right now that doesn't do anything. It's when we put this table head in here that we're actually starting to add some data to it. So we'll indicate that we want to do the various list types and tags. And if we save that and refresh now, we can start to see the table taking shape. We've got two column headers now that are showing up there. In the footer, I'll put a row in the footer. And here we'll do the TD, or the table data. And I'll just put, for our example, just a sentence here rather than some summaries. And we'll see how that'll render out. So we've got our header, we've got our footer. You can see that's going to show up now. And you'll notice the way these things are lining up. So we have a row in the heading, and we have two different table headers. So we've got kind of two columns. And then in the footer we have a row, and we just have the one column. And so you'll notice down here that that's flowing underneath the first column of the headers, and then this second column is standing out here all on its own. So let's go into the body, and we'll add in a couple of table rows, and each one of these is going to have two cells in it. So we'll have that row, and then let's copy that and paste it down here. So we've got our list types, so we might have our unordered list and our ordered list. And then for the tags, we want to use our escape characters here. So we'll do and less than UL, and we'll do greater than, and then we'll do the less than again, and we'll do the list item and put that in there as well. And I'll kind of cheat a little bit. For the ordered list, we'll copy that over, and we'll just chase this to OL. We'll save that and refresh. And now we're starting to get a little more of a table. Still got our caption, we've got our headers, and now we're starting to see these columns coming in. And if I highlight it, you can kind of see that we've got the headers, and that left column then is the first header and the first cell, the first table data from each item. Because our footer only had one TD, one table data, it's falling into that first column along with all of the others. Also note that the headers, because we use the TH, those headers are coming out as bolded. That's something that the client is doing here. If I go back and change this to a TD in here, you'll see it just shows up left justified, slightly changes the typeface. So the browsers, the clients, treat those table headers a little bit differently when they're rendering that out. So we have a basic structure. We can see now that we've got these items in there. We've got our rows and our columns and our caption for the table. We've got our table with some rows in it, but not everything's going to fit nicely. We've seen that our table footer, for example, had that one simple column, and it was always going to be left justified and always lined up with those first columns. But we're going to see that we have needs for columns and rows to span, or rather to have a table data element span columns and rows. So on a particular table cell, we can use the col span and row span attributes to get those things to span across the table elements to render correctly. We go back to our table here. Let's add one more header. We'll call that uses. So this is where I want to come in now and add in some uses for these various lists. And I'll come down now to the unordered list, the first one, and I want to put a table data item in here and identify the use, and I'll say it's useful for displaying a simple list of items. Now if we save that and refresh, we can see that that makes sense, but I really want, conceptually, if we highlight this again, you can kind of see that. I really want that not just to be in the unordered list, but it really applies to the ordered list as well. So I'm going to do two things here. One, I'm going to come back up to my table and use something we'll talk about in a moment, which is the border, because that's going to make it a little easier for you to visualize how these cells are laying out. You can see now each of the cells has a border around them, and you can see how they're flowing. And then I'm going to come down to that table data again, and I'm going to add the row span. I'm going to say this particular item spans 2 rows. So the default obviously is that it would just span 1. We save that and refresh, and you can see now from the box and also the alignment of the text, that particular table cell now spans these 2 rows. So the content that's in there is going to flow across both of those rows. Likewise, I could go to my footer on the TD, and I could say col span equals 3. And now if I refresh, we can see that that's no longer stuck in the first column. Everything re-rendered a little bit here because this column is now spanning, or rather this cell is spanning 3 columns, and the other columns now can be rendered smaller because they don't have to. That first one doesn't have to fit all of this content. So this now spans all the way across those items. So the col span and the row span allow you to flow those table cells to really lay out the table the way you need to when you have data that perhaps applies to multiple rows or that applies to multiple columns. I'm showing it here with the column, the table data on the far right spanning the rows and the bottom spanning the columns, but it could really be anywhere within the table that you do this row span and col span.